Great. As we're slowly trickling into the room, welcome everyone for what's already been an exciting day two of PeaceCon. I know it's been really thought-provoking, and it's hard to think of a topic that's more relevant for this kind of conversation than one that's focused on the intersection of conflict, climate, and particularly communities and the participation of those who are most affected by conflicts around the world. For those who don't know me, I'm Mike Jobmans. I'm the Vice President of Global Affairs and Partnerships at Search for Common Ground. We're very keen and pleased to be a partner of Alliance for Peacebuilding and to be participating in this year's PeaceCon. And we have a really excellent and exciting conversation prepared for you all. We have Kim Thompson from USAID. Kim is an American diplomat. She's also the senior advisor for natural resource governance with the USAID. She's had a long career focused on natural resource and environmental diplomacy, and right now leads USAID's work on artisanal small-scale mining. She served in a number of places that are familiar, I think, to some of those who are with us on the call, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo and leading USAID's Office for Land and Urbanization. A lot of experience that she'll be sharing with us. We also have with us Elise. She's with the Responsible Business Alliance, which is the largest industry association focused on supply chains globally. Comes out of the electronics industry, has a lot of participation from the auto, toy manufacturing, and electronics manufacturing. She's been with them and started her career with UL, one of the main certifiers, then served with Hewlett Packard, managing their supply chain and human rights issues, and now is going to be joining and is now with the Responsible Business Alliance. Those are also the partner organization for the Responsible Minerals Initiative, Responsible Labor, Responsible Factory initiatives, which some of us are also familiar with. So we're really super glad to have Alex here from an industry perspective. And from a civil society perspective, we have a friend and colleague, Laurent Kasindi, who is a Congolese journalist and author, perhaps by background, but over his past 15 years with Search for Common Ground has been leading a lot of our work in Congo, throughout Africa, and now globally out of Brussels as we work to develop sort of conflict management and training programs in particular. So really glad for this rich conversation, but I'm equally pleased to see, as I scroll through the names of those who are participating, just a wealth of expertise from across the peace-building field, from academia, from government, from civil society here. And so, it's always painful to be in these Omicron and COVID-induced sort of virtual rooms. But I'd love everyone, if you could, just take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box. And then also the chat should be on for people to be able to talk to one another. So it'd be a great chance to also connect with your fellow participants and try and get a little bit of that virtual networking. And for those who feel comfortable in sort of follow-ups, please do drop in your contact information, either for the whole group or to share it with one another, so we can continue sort of the connections the same way as if we were catching up over poor cake, pastries, and worse coffee in some conference room in DC. So thanks a lot again for everyone for joining. This is a panel that's particularly meaningful for Search for Common Ground, and that we're pleased to host. Here at Search, we tend to make very, very long commitments to supporting peace building in the societies where we work. We plan over a decade or more. And as we looked around the world and really looked at sort of where some of the key issues and natural partnerships are, particularly outside of government and in the private sector, at the industries that similarly shared, that had abiding interests in conflict-affected societies, that tended to make long-term commitments to those societies, and have some interest in the well-being of conflict-affected communities or in nations. The natural resources industry is one that has immovable supply chains and is in many ways invested in and interested in almost every corner of any corner of the world. And whereas a lot of companies will pull out of a place like Afghanistan or a place like Myanmar. The companies with immovable supply chains tend to have long-term commitments and interests there. And it's one where us as a peace building organization are keen to sort of be participating and be looking at as we seek allies, to sort of drive forward sort of the healthy, safe, and just societies that our organization is committed to. So that's one reason that this is something that I would argue is super important. It's super important for I think many of the peace building community around the world to be paying attention to. The second, of course, is that there's a climate crisis. There are major changes afoot in terms of infrastructure, in terms of how the green economy is evolving day by day, and the degree to which conflict-affected people are included and have an opportunity to participate in what's really the next industrial revolution is one that's just incredibly meaningful, both for civil society groups wherever they are based and with an accountability to those societies, but secondly, to try and find sort of multi-stakeholder perspectives on how to move things forward. And that's why I'm really keen to have this kind of blend of government, civil society, and industry reflected in this kind of conversation. And so without further ado, let me open up the floor and give a quick run of show. We are on the record today, and so in addition to those who are participating in the live conversation, this will be available online for posterity, for people who want to follow on or shows with colleagues afterwards. And we have a really great lineup of perspectives. I'm gonna give the floor in just a second to Kim Thompson to highlight a new report that USAID has launched. USAID, for our international colleagues, is the main agency for international cooperation of the United States government in promoting development cooperation around the world. So Kim will be highlighting some of their new report that outlines some of their thinking, not only about the potential harms that natural resource extraction and development can play, but also some of the potential development benefits and where that might fit. And I'm particularly keen to hear also, maybe in the discussion about how it might fit with the Global Fragility Act and some of the other kinds of things that the U.S. government is thinking about. And then we're going to hear from industry, from Alex, who's going to share a little bit about how industry is thinking about the intersection of green minerals and high conflict places. And then finally over to Laurent for his own sort of take on these issues, how he, from civil society as well as is thinking about these kinds of issues. So without further ado, Kim, the floor is yours. To pull up, I think you'll walk us through a quick presentation, and really looking forward to this conversation. So Kim, over to you, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mike, for that wonderful introduction to the topic and for organizing what is, in my opinion, a very timely and important panel discussion on green energy minerals. So thank you for that. And one of the things I took away from your introduction is that we can and we must, manage the transition to a low carbon economy, thoughtfully and with an eye towards prioritizing equity, inclusion, and managing, as you mentioned, Mike, managing risks. And that's what I would like to talk about for a little bit today. The reason that USAID and seemingly everyone else right now is talking about green energy minerals is really quite simple. Our future relies on mining and quite a bit more mining. To put it simply, we can't have the electric vehicles and the solar panels without green energy minerals. It's what makes them work. And just as fossil fuels have met our global energy needs for over a century, there are several dozen minerals that are forming the backbone of tomorrow's energy systems. So we need to pay attention because these green energy minerals are going to have a profound impact on our future. So addressing the development challenges surrounding mining and the responsible supply chains is more important than ever before. And we need to learn to do mining better. We need to learn to do mining smarter. We need to learn to do mining cleaner. And we need to learn to do mining fairer. It's important for our future. It's really just as simple as that. I wanted to take just a second before I get into the report to talk about, there's a lot of different definitions sort of swirling around, and just to make sure we're all on the same page on what we're talking about when we're talking about green energy minerals. There's a few different categories that you may have heard of. There are critical minerals, and that's the biggest category. That's that big blue circle, and that's 35 minerals that are critical to the U.S. National security and our economy. There's also a small select group of minerals that we call conflict minerals. Those are ones that are subject to particular legislation, and those do not actually overlap with green energy minerals. So if you look at the green circle, that's what we're talking about when we talk about green energy minerals. We actually started with 29 minerals that are used in green energy technologies, and then narrowed it down using a number of criteria to find, we narrowed it down to 16, which we believe are the most important green energy minerals for us to be paying attention to. And the other thing that's important here is that 11 of those overlap with critical minerals. So there's quite a bit of overlap between green energy minerals and critical minerals. The US government has sent out consistent policy messages that we need to be paying attention to critical minerals. And the White House, for instance, had a 100-day review of critical minerals that highlighted our need for sustainable supply chains because of our climate goals, as well as because of our manufacturing needs and defense needs. And they also highlighted, importantly, that those supply chains need to be responsible in some way. So they need to be consistent with America's labor, environment, and equity and other values. What hasn't been discussed as much in this race to secure green energy minerals and meet our climate goals and ensure that our economy is competitive, one of the things that has often been underrepresented in the conversations on green energy minerals are questions like, how will this increased demand for minerals impact the developing world? How will it impact resource-rich developing countries? How will it play out in fragile and conflict-affected environments? How could the shift towards mining, threaten some of our development investments? Or how could responsible mining raise standards and contribute to broader peace and security efforts? Where might we see the differences? Where might we be concerned about backsliding or renewed conflicts, and where might we expect to see some positive benefits? And finally, how might poor governance poor governance and conflict disrupt mineral supply chains and threaten our ability to meet some climate goals? And I'm not seeing the slides anymore. I don't know if others are having that issue as well. Oh, perfect. Thank you. And so for all these reasons, that's why we developed a report. That's why USAID decided to develop a report to help shed light on some of these questions and this topic, and from a development perspective, and really get the conversation started. We don't have all the answers, but we wanted to start the conversation. So I'd like to spend the remainder of my time just highlighting a few of the things that we found in that report. I encourage everyone to look at the full report. It's a long report. It's 125 pages, has a lot of information in there. It can be found on the Land Links website, which I can put in the chat box later. There are also 2 shorter reports, a 25-page sort of summary for policymakers and a 4-page issue brief. So there's a series of different reports of different lengths, but I wanted to highlight a few of the findings. So this chart shows the projected increase in demand for some of the select green energy minerals. I can't fit them all on these slides, so I just selected some, under a 2-degree scenario. And that's important because we have, the global target is 1.5 degrees. So this is actually quite a conservative scenario. And even under a conservative scenario, we are looking at estimates for minerals like graphite, lithium, and cobalt, that the global demand will likely increase upwards of nearly 500% by 2050. That is a huge increase in demand for some of these minerals. And the other thing to note on this slide is they're largely used for battery, for energy storage. That's what that battery little icon is for. So that's the most important use. And this is just a quick note that the numbers on the previous slide are really just our best estimates. We don't know. The future is really unknown. I wanted to draw your attention to, this is just a few of the sort of factors that create some uncertainty in our numbers. One of the things that I wanted to highlight here is recycling, because recycling and the circular economy, you know, it can and it must be a critical part of our solution. But that being said, from all the estimates that we currently have, you know, we can't recycle our way out of this. We are going to need more raw materials, and because the need is just too high. So it should be part of the solution, but we also need to think about mining. So then the question is, where is the mining happening? And you know, where can we sort of expect it to happen? And this slide shows U.S. presence countries that are one of the top 3 global producers for each of the minerals. So you can see, for instance, that Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the top 3 global producers for cobalt. You can see that Indonesia, the Philippines are top producers of nickel, for example. And what's interesting with this as well is that, so these are just showing the top, one of the top 3 producers. And so if you were going to look at if you were going to include countries that were not just among the top 3 producers, but are just producing these minerals, then it basically covers almost all of U.S. presence countries. So it's very, very widespread. So this map only shows the top 3 producers of current producers of given minerals. And then we were looking at what risks and development challenges are currently associated with the green energy minerals that we identified. And I don't think there's any major surprises here. These are the categories that we found in terms of development risks and challenges. I will note that the national and local economic growth is the one that's maybe the most difficult to understand. That's really looking at those conflicts or challenges around control and benefits from mining, local versus national. Some of those issues. And what this slide shows is, again, just a subset of the green energy minerals, because again, I can't fit them all on a single slide, and the development risks that are currently associated in the literature with mining of these particular minerals. And they're roughly listed in order of importance that we found them in the literature. And so starting on the left-hand side of the slide being sort of the most important risks or the most cited risks in the literature, and then moving along to the right. So if you look, for instance, I highlighted lithium as an example. That first icon that you see is, is environment. So the environmental issues are the ones that are the most mentioned in the literature, and then followed by conflict, and then subsequently the other issues. And so what you see here on this slide is that there's quite a few risks that are associated with each of these minerals, and they vary mineral to mineral. So it really is important to look at these as a whole, but also in their specific context. And here is what I think the good news is from what we saw when we dug into the literature, is that mining is not new, the risks are not novel, and we actually have a lot of tools at our disposal to manage the risks and ensure that mining can contribute to overall development. We just need to pay attention, and we need to use the tools that we have and continue to make progress in this sector. Responsible companies, such as those that are in the Responsible Minerals Initiative, for example, they can create best practice guidance or follow international standards and due diligence schemes. Civil society can do a whole number of things. They can monitor mining risks and elevate community grievances. And donors like USAID can continue to pay attention, and be ready to help. So some of the good news coming out of this is I think we know how to, in a lot of ways, we know how to respond. We have some tools. It might be a new challenge, but we have a lot of the tools that we're going to need to address the challenge. So the report actually goes into each one of the challenges and lists a number of potential things that we could do. I listed some of them in this slide, but the report would dig into a lot more of that. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that USAID, along with many other US government agencies, multinational organizations and civil society organizations, I think we're all trying to get smarter about green energy minerals, and we still do have a lot to learn. And that's why we produced this report, and that's why I'm personally looking forward to discussions like this one today, to share what we've learned and listen to the private sector and listen to civil society and listen to all the other important stakeholders that have so much to share. So I look forward to this conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kim. I think it's really eye-opening. I think, as someone who's been in this space for a while, in the conflict space for a while, I just think back at how economics blind and minerals blind I've been in the past as well. And a couple of things that were just really jaw-dropping for me reading your report. Anytime we see 500% increases, it is just absolutely striking. And the second to hear that conflict is the #2 risk after environmental damage in this industry. And yet I don't know how much we in the conflict space are really looking at this. And I'd be curious also from the government side, to what extent CMM or some of CVP and some of the other conflict agencies, specialized conflict and security agencies are looking at this. And then the third, just looking at how little we know. I lived in Bujumbura, Burundi for a number of years. And to think that just 10 kilometers away was one of the richest rare earths deposits in Africa, and yet none of us, neither I nor anyone sort of working on sorry about that. I think I may have dropped for a second. But even just the degree to which, the whole community of people working on conflict and human rights in Burundi were sitting, 10 kilometers from one of the hugest rare earth deposits, potential rare earth deposits, with very little knowledge of everything coming down the pipe and what that meant for the economy and for the society. So thank you again for drawing attention to that. But I'm happy to turn over to people who are much smarter and well-informed than I. So Alex, you lead this obviously for industry. I'd love to hear about what you guys are thinking and really your reactions to what Kim said, and sort of how you see the role of government, how you see the role of industry in sort of harnessing the opportunities as well as mitigating a lot of those kind of challenges that Kim laid out.
Sure, and that's quite a compliment, but I don't think it's accurate to say smarter or better informed on these issues. It's definitely a collaboration here. But thank you so much for having me. As introduced, in case I don't know everyone here on the call, my name is Alexandra Czech, and I'm a senior project manager with the Responsible Minerals Initiative, which is part of the larger umbrella organization, the Responsible Business Alliance. And if you're not familiar with our work, we're about over 400 members now. So we're a business association of primarily downstream companies, but increasingly some midstream supply chain companies. And what we do is provide these companies with tools and resources to make sourcing decisions that improve regulatory compliance and support responsible sourcing of minerals from conflict affected and high risk areas. It's really our belief that by working together as industry, we are evolving business practices to support responsible mineral production and sourcing globally, which supports our vision that mineral supply chains can contribute positively to social economic development globally. So I hope that's a good intro to our organization. And if you'd like any more information, you can contact me or visit our website. And I think we have just a slide here for a quick overview for you. But, getting to the issue at hand, for us, we're seeing the same trends. So just to echo what Kim said, we're having the same conversations, talking about these critical minerals. And I really appreciated her slide with that overlap of these minerals that will really fuel the green transition and the electric vehicles and all the materials that rely on batteries. And as we've seen global demand for cobalt rise, we've also seen cobalt supply chain stakeholders, and here I'm meaning midstream, downstream companies, regulators, and civil society all push for reputable, established programs and practices that allow companies to demonstrate that they're adhering to best practice when it comes to responsible cobalt sourcing and production. So I think it's fair to echo here that companies are also really asking for us to do more. How can we evolve? Like Kim said, taking what we've already learned, but really expanding and making sure that the tools and resources available are really fit for purpose for this new generation, I would say, even of challenges. These new minerals that we're really taking an increased and sharper focused look at. But I think what we also really hear from them is not just what can we do, but how can we start to really build credible systems that people can join and be a part of to really demonstrate not only efficiencies in this work and collaboration, but also so they can demonstrate to others that, yes, they're doing something, it's recognized, it's reputable, and here's evidence of it. And that's really important for companies. And I really do want to stress here, how much of this push is coming from companies. I think it's so interesting to have been a part of this larger industry group for so long. My own background is probably similar to many of yours, where you haven't just worked with one organization throughout your career, and perhaps you've worked with more than one sector, whether it's rotating from government to the private sector to civil society. And I think those lenses are so important. And we're seeing increasingly companies have representatives that have come from civil society or have come from government roles. And I think that really helps them to understand how important that concept of responsible sourcing is and what it really means to go beyond do no harm. So I think that the question we're all asking is not, is this important, because that is certainly well known and well documented, but how are we going to address this challenge collectively as stakeholders, and not just as the downstream companies, which are primarily our members, but also looking at each of the actors in the supply chain. And cobalt is really the example I want to use today, because I think it's been the one that we have been working on for the longest of this really, new critical group of minerals. And if we look at the cobalt supply chain, you want to take a look at the ASM miner, or maybe the large scale mining operation, the traders and the processors, the refiners, the manufacturers, and the downstream companies. And it's important to look at all of these actors to not just understand the challenges, but the conditions in which they're operating. A former professor of mine once called it the rules of the game. How do incentives work? What are the laws? And not just the laws, but the challenges that might not be formal, but very much exist. And by better understanding those conditions in which each actor operates, we're better able to collaborate with them and create the right incentives for change to make sure that we can achieve these enhanced responsible sourcing practices. And so I think that's really what we've learned from the past, is how to try and take this enhanced perspective, how to try to work more collaboratively. As Kim said, I do think the tools and resources, they're out there. We've been working on challenges in the mineral space for 15, 20 years, in a very focused way, and definitely beyond that. And so I think we can really try to take these tools and resources, and like I said, maybe expand them, maybe apply them a little bit differently, making sure they're flexible in their approach. But we've already learned that you can use that really key point in your supply chain of smelters and refiners, which is where most of the mixing takes place. So it's important to make sure that we can continue to work with these actors to make sure that we have the right controls, to know where materials are coming from in the first place, which is very important if you're going to effectively get something done on the ground. We also know that we have to work with the sourcing countries more effectively, not just as suppliers to these global supply chains, but as partners. And I think that means really taking a perspective for us from more than just industry, but working with our government representatives, working with our partners in civil society, and making sure we're having these linkages in every one of these spaces to more collaboratively and effectively get this work done. And we also want to make sure that the mining communities around these minerals where they're found are benefiting. It's really difficult to just say that a price increase will be felt all the way up the supply chain. I think many of us know that's not really the case. And for minerals and the different metals, that's very difficult with just the way that they're traded. So I think we have to look at how we can be investing in these communities, how we can be investing in the sites, what the best systems are to do that, knowing that some supply chain actors will benefit from some of these in a commercial way, but knowing that everyone feels this benefit from an externality perspective. And so I think there's a lot of really rich conversations that need to take place around how we can be investing in these communities more. And I think as kind of a final lesson that I've taken away is that we really should be taking all of the feedback that we've had in the last 15 years about that idea of partnership and really engaging with these communities, empowering local voices, making sure grievance mechanisms are effective and available, valuing consultation and dialogue with these communities as well. This is not just about imposing expectations. This is about creating expectations together. And I think we need to make sure that that's a part of this conversation, is not just what we want to do and how fast we want to move, but how we bring everyone along as part of that conversation. And in case I think I still have another minute here, just as an example of our work, we've been very active in RMI trying to set out an artisanal and small scale mining set of requirements or expectations for responsible sourcing. And in order to do that, it's been so important for us to partner with governments and civil society, as I mentioned, with academia. And we've actually been spending about a year and a half working collaboratively with the Responsible Cobalt Initiative, which is the refiners that are based in China, which is a big part of the middle of that supply chain, and working with stakeholders in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to really try to lay out some of these expectations. It's important that we had a consultation that took place last summer to really talk to people about what is a fair expectation, what's a fair requirement. A lot of these requirements require investments, financial investments. They're not, these expectations are not met because people are uninterested. They're not being met because they cost a lot of money to have all the safety equipment and meet all those requirements for health and safety. So I get too quick for myself here. So it's really important that we make sure that these conversations are had so we understand how we can better invest to address some of these challenges and root causes. So that's just one example, and I'm happy to expand a little more on it. But I really think we're trying to take an industry approach to greater collaboration, taking these lessons learned from the past, and really trying to have a renewed approach and focus going forward to make sure that these solutions can stick. Because as Kim explained, we see this demand being staying around for a while. I think these minerals will be in demand for a long time. So we really need to make sure that we approach this with a long-term vision.
Thanks a lot, Alex. And before coming to Laura, I want to ask you a quick follow-up. I know RMI and responsible business describe yourself as a union for progressive business, or and of course there's a lot of non-progressive business in this space, which I think we should also come to a conversation about. But I'd be curious, before I let you off the hook and we go to Laurent and then Q&A, if you were Joe Biden or Samantha Power, the head of USAID, what do you talked about what your industry is doing? Like, what do you guys want from government, and what do you guys want from like civil society? If you were the head of Search or Human Rights Watch or whoever, what are you guys looking for from other stakeholders? From the industry side, and from the progressive industry side, and I'd love to unpack that a little bit more in the Q&A.
Sure. Happy to answer that. I'm so glad this is public. So as I make recommendations to the president, maybe these will be seen.
A phone call.
Yeah, just a light one. Sure. So I think, look, we very much follow the UN guiding principles as a starting point, just to say that we see the role of government as to protect human rights and the role of business as to respect human rights. And I think civil society plays a big role in helping us to better understand how we can do that, serving as guidance and also as whistleblowers in many sense, in a large sense. I think for government, what we find it being important is the fact that uniform expectations can be quite helpful. If I think about any business, if I get questions all day, every day, a dozen different questions from a dozen different stakeholders, and very few of them overlap, my entire job becomes responding to questions. I'm no longer really able to focus on the core of my business. And so I think, while I'm not saying we don't need to ask questions or ask for conformance requirements, I think it's important to have uniform and efficient requests. So how can people bring together these requirements as we've done as industry? But it would be great to, align that with government as well. How can these be more aligned and uniform so that if you are an actor in the supply chain or if you are a stakeholder, you have a set of expectations that you can answer that meets the needs of all these different groups? I think that's incredibly helpful. And the more we can collaborate that's important. And one other point I would say is that, we often use the analogy, when the tide goes up, the boats go up. We know that business operates in a spectrum. There's leaders of the pack on different issues. There's people that stay with the pack from, that's their risk appetite level. And there can be people that lag behind the pack. What can often help set everyone forward is when the tide goes up, meaning if you set a regulation, then everyone has to go up to meet that regulation. I think it's important to be very discerning when you apply that, because you need to make sure that businesses can actually do it. It shouldn't be just that you create this hurdle for them and then they have to figure out how to meet it when there's really no available tools to do that. So again, I think that's just where dialogue and consultation are important. What is reasonable to ask a business? What is a progressive approach to getting there? How can we help the businesses get there? And just making sure we're being very reasonable in these approaches. So I think just good logic and good collaboration is important here.
As well as talk about sort of collaboration, but also sort of all the actors who shape whether or not a business, and whether or not an operation meets its obligations or meets its aspirations. Civil society obviously plays a huge role in that. So super glad to turn the floor over to a longtime friend and colleague, Laurent, who leads a lot of our global thinking at Search on this, but obviously also has spent a lot of time. He's from Congo and spent a lot of time in mining communities, probably in mining communities from his journalistic career and probably before that as well. So over to you, Laurent. I'd love to hear from you, sort of how you, as you hear sort of a government perspective, an American government perspective, a business perspective, like what of this resonates with you? What doesn't resonate with you? As you think about both the Congolese experience, but the wider sort of set of how communities affected by conflict or looking to sort of drive their own development and prosperity think about the sort of train that's coming down the tracks of 500+% growth in in the value of what sits under their soil.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I'm so glad to be able to bring some feed perspective here. I'll start by saying that challenges and opportunities associated to green energy mining are not perceived the same, in developed countries as in African countries or in developing countries. We can all imagine that the term new green economy is a concept which speaks more to countries which have built strong economies, before even thinking of green economy, and now moving to new green economy. I'm just saying it to remind all of us here how much the imbalance between developed countries and poor countries when it comes to climate change threats is something we need to recognize and take into consideration. Just some examples, thinking of an electric car is something you can only do if you've had a car, or if there is already an answer to your needs for mobility. You can talk about electric battery if you have had a battery in the past, or if you can access some sort of energy in the place you're living. A shift from fossil fuels to alternative energy sources remain on top of the agenda of most of the rich countries, while the construction of roads, schools, hospitals, houses for families is what is on the top of the priorities for developing countries. Talking about my country, Congo, for example, I don't think people have met in Ituri or in the Kivus, which are some of the mining areas in the DRC. These people, I don't think, are much more concerned about the future of the humanity when they have to wake up every morning wondering if they will stay alive until the evening because of insecurity. And I have to say that part of this unfortunate situation has been made possible many decades ago by business people and governments who probably thought that making money and developing the technology sector was more important than caring about the lives of people living in rural communities in Madagascar or in Guinea or in Congo, for example. So we have now reached the point where we have to deal together with a concerning future, while some members of the human community are still living in places where they are fearing about their lives. They are struggling to access water, food, health treatment, and education for their children. The good news, I think, for all of us here, is that for some of these forgotten people, the world still needs some strategic minerals located in their homelands. So for me as a Congolese citizen, I would like to say it sounds to me like the international community is given a second chance to correct some of the mistakes which have been made in the past at the moment there was a high demand of coltan. Now, when I was going through the USAID reports, I have to recognize I was pleased to see that the major concern is no longer only about how the roads will respond to the need for cobalt and graphite and lithium, but also to ensure that the extraction of the strategic minerals benefit to the populations who live in the mining areas, and globally how this can benefit to their countries. Now the point is, and it's not an easy question, how do we get there? And you'd ask me that question, I would be honest to say there is no simple answer. I can just share some reflection from my side, and I think we're gonna get more from this conversation. So, but from a civil society and peacebuilding perspective, what I have to say is, I think there should always be a place around the table for community representatives and civil society when there is a mining deal being negotiated or signed. It's quite shameful to admit, but in many of our countries, we cannot assume that the governments, actors necessarily represent the interests of their populations, unfortunately. And we have to, I'd like to say, if we can have more local actors who are involved in the discussions, probably it's likely that we're going to have their community's expectations also taken into consideration. Another point direct to Alexandra probably. I don't know if you're gonna like it, Alexandra, but I know it's quite demanding sometimes. But I believe from my experience in meeting communities in the mining areas, people know that mining companies, they have a better access to some decision makers nationally and internationally, but they tend to limit too much their community responsibility to building some schools, taking pictures and posting them on their website, and that's all. So probably when there is something wrong going on in those communities, we believe that the voice of the mining sectors, if they want to do that, combined with the expressions and any recommendation coming from the field, could be also helpful, to try to see how some of the issues people are facing in the fields can be brought to the agenda of decision makers, at country level and outside. Another point I would like to make is regarding traceability, which has been a very interesting experience. I would just like to say traceability is good, but not enough. Because my feeling is that it's mostly serves, the external reputation of the minerals or of the mining companies to the international market probably, but without necessarily demonstrating that the local communities benefited from the exploitation. And my last point I would like to make is just to say, I know that mining in conflict zone is very difficult, and we have sometimes been invited as Search for Common Ground to work closely with some mining companies to see how they can they can respond to some of the challenges they're facing regarding conflict dynamics. I would say it's also an opportunity for mining companies to increase their capacity in what we call conflict sensitivity. And the good news is that there are many people and organizations who hold the expertise to support conflict sensitivity. So in conclusion, let me just say that the existence of strategic minerals in many fragile states is an opportunity for the world today to deal with the climate change threats and issues. I would say we now need to take it also as an opportunity for those communities to get a door open to the world, to gain probably peace, to gain employment, and to gain development. The answer is how. It's not only about what people get from there, but what is the process which is put in place, and how the mining company will stop what I call a pick, collect, and fly approach, and find another way of probably bringing to those locations much more representatives of the mining value chain. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laurent. And in terms of how we'll proceed from now, I think if people could signal, if they want to speak, if they can just signal that in the chat, feel free to type a question and I'll read it out. But if you want to ask a question live, if you signal, hey, I'd like to speak, Ali from among the conference organizers will unvideo you. And so I'll be watching around and she'll turn on your video. So while people put their inputs in, and I'd be particularly keen also, we've heard from Laurent and the Congolese perspective, we talked a good bit about cobalt, which is incredibly important. I'd love to hear from some of the other participants calling in. I know we have people from Africa, from Asia, a number of Latin American participants as well. So I'd love to hear perspectives from those industries and those countries and societies as they've evolved. So please don't hesitate to jump into the conversation. But while people get ready, I wanted to take the moderator's prerogative, Kim, of putting you on the spot and saying, I think we've heard from Laurent, we've heard from Alex a little bit about sort of what they hope happens and implied in that a role that the American government and other like-minded governments might play. This is a really exciting report. I hope everyone reads it and eye-opening for me. But what next? I'm hoping this is not the end, but the jump-off point. So where is this going within the agency? Where is this? What are the next kinds of things that we can look for, particularly for those on the outside world who are looking to see how they can work with government, or maybe have ideas about how the government could support them? Some things that spring to my own mind is like elsewhere in this conference, we've talked a lot about the Global Fragility Act, and there is a public-private partnership push there. I know with like MEPA sort of in the Middle East, there's a lot of focus on how public-private partnerships and businesses can support peace. So what might, from where you sit, might you be seeing or hoping from the administration writ large, or from USAID, like what can we be looking for as next steps coming off this report?
Yeah, thank you for that, Mike. So where we're at now is we really are at a time where we are reflecting on where we should be headed. So the future, I think we're still developing where we're going. That being said, I do think that there are a number of links to larger policy priorities that we are discussing. For example, some people may have seen that that USAID released a draft climate strategy that was out for public comment for a while. If you did see that, you will have noticed that green energy minerals were included in that draft climate strategy. Again, that's not a final strategy. It's just in draft form at this time. That's one place where we may see some furthering sort of green energy minerals. Other places that there are some sort of obvious overlaps are with the anti-corruption agenda of the Biden administration. There was a summit for democracy that was held where there was some discussion about the role of mining and extractive industries in our sort of larger anti-corruption goals, and also some conversations around sort of on the illicit side of things around transnational organized crime and how that could intersect with mining. And it's interesting that you brought up the Global Fragility Act. There are obvious linkages there. I think we're actually talking about those linkages a little bit less at this point, and you're giving me some homework as well. So I appreciate that, because I think we should be talking about specifically how this is intersecting with the Global Fragility Act as well.
Awesome, thanks. We have a question from Elise Elsa Barron. Elsa, do you mind? Can you ask your question? I saw you put some thoughts there, but if you can ask it on the live, I would appreciate it. Elsa, you're live now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Go right ahead.
Okay.
And if you can introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, so thanks so much for all of your thoughts. My name is Elsa Barron, and I'm a program assistant at the Center for Climate and Security. And my question is that in addition to implementing better practices and thinking deeply about the role of extractive industries and communities and how to better listen to community voices, make sure that there's substantial community empowerment and benefit that comes from these industries, I think it's also clear that there are many challenges. Extractive industries are very complex, and there's likely inevitable harms to communities and the environment that comes. So my question is, how can we both think about how to change and improve extractive industries and also think about the role of questioning consumption as part of the root of these challenges and an important part of the solution for moving forward as well?
That's a great question. Kim, I'd love your sort of thoughts on the strategic side. And I think both you and Alex, I'd love to hear thoughts on consumption. And I think also maybe in Alice's question is also sort of an allusion to also the sense of waste and recycling and where that kind of fits, if I can put some words into Elsa's mouth, that the question of consumption, the question of also the waste that's inherent in a lot of these technology industries.
Yeah, and these are really important questions around consumption, around waste, around particularly the circular economy. The circular economy is certainly getting more attention, rightfully so. And USAID and certainly other US government agencies as well are thinking about what we can do to help support, a circular economy to relieve some of the increased demand for new raw materials. Yeah, thanks.
Great, and I'm happy to add on there. That's a great question. Well, first, just to make sure I set the scope correctly, I do want to make sure I just qualify that we don't pretend or claim to speak for all extractives, because with the Responsible Business Alliance, just important to highlight that the majority of our members are downstream. We do increasingly, work with many midstream companies, and that can be part of their supply chain. But I just know that I couldn't speak in full to the breadth and scope of all of their practices and activities. But I think at a broad level, what we can definitely still answer about that question is, how we can work with companies in this way. Well, I think if you even look at the trajectory over time, it's really interesting. A lot of the scope, and when I say the scope, meaning the questions that these companies were asked, reflect the regulation and the trends at the time. So at least from a downstream perspective, a lot of the questions initially reflected Dodd-Frank, the 3 TGs, right? Tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. You saw an expansion of these minerals very much with the change with the green, this transition, but also as you're looking at new regulations coming out of Europe. So you're seeing an increased scope to even ask the questions in the first place. And then I would say the types of questions being asked have also changed. They went from more of a, how is this contributing to conflict? And I'm just saying that at a broad level, to more of the OECD Annex 2 risks, which broadened more, including child labor, but have not broadened as fully on all of the environmental points. And we're seeing that transition take place now, again, in line with these conversations. So I think it's interesting to just, look at these trends on a map to say we've seen the scope evolve in terms of the minerals and metals that are being discussed, but the scope of questions they're being asked. Because I would say as a very starting point, you're not going to see change on what you're not measuring, you're not tracking, you're not asking, you're not auditing. You're not going to see those changes. So when you start to expand the scope, you're going to get more data, more information, and you're going to raise expectations of what people should be doing in that space. And so it's not just reflecting regulation, that's also just reflecting international best practice. So any agreements or standards that get set. But I think that's kind of an interesting point to say, this all kind of moves in a pack. So I think we are seeing a bigger push for ESG indicators at the mining level. Again, ASM, LSM, I've seen more push for that. We, even at RMI, released a new environmental and social governance ESG standard that can be applied to smelters and refiners, because we see a push and ask for that now where there wasn't a few years ago. So I think that is kind of showing what we're seeing in terms of being asked. And in terms of consumption and circularity, yes, those are also the trends we're seeing. It's just such a timely discussion to come together for this discussion, because we do have a portfolio that is really working to address those questions, how to address circularity, expectations, and then also I'd add this to say, how do you work with recyclers? These are entities themselves. How do you work with them on making sure these same standards are met for best practice? That's now a new actor in the supply chain, if you think about it. So that's a part of the conversation. And I think what I would see for consumers and really for everyone is education matters, and being able to educate each other about what we're seeing and educate consumers about what we're seeing is so important, because it helps us all to operate from a more informed point of view so that we can ask questions that help drive change. So I think we know that PR, whether you call it that or marketing or just education, is so important to make sure we're communicating what we're doing and what we're seeing as well.
Well, let me follow up on that, because we do have a question in the chat from Tom Gillespie, who's been having some tech issues, and so he just dropped offline. So I'm going to mirror Tom, let's say, and he asked basically that a follow up on this question. I think it's really for all three panelists, which is, fundamentally, are the metrics for social change good enough? On environmental performance, there are standards in a lot of areas of any business operation. I'd be curious, what kind of metrics USAID uses, Search for Common Ground uses, and businesses use, particularly as we talk about some of these other issues about social cohesion, about conflict, about human rights. What are the kind of metrics you use, and if there are gaps, what do you guys see as the main gaps? Maybe Laura, I'll come to you first, since you're sort of very frontline and out in these communities, and then I'd love to hear from Kim, and then Alex, if you can also expand a little bit on this question of like, A, what kind of standards actually exist, and then B, like if there's a gap, who fills them? How do we do that? But over to you, Laurent, first.
My reflection is, once again, it's very difficult to talk from the mining perspective, right? So what are the standards that exist? What are the metrics they're using? What I've seen, for example, in the Katanga, it sounded to me like for most of the companies, the most important for them was to make sure that they have been able to implement some, what they call the social or development activities, meaning that they defined from the beginning a set of concrete actions they would take. For example, building a market, I saw that, building a school, building one hospital. In some cases, this has been discussed with the government. And in some limited cases, it was actually agreed with the local communities. Just because from the moment they give a space for the local communities to express their needs, what happens is that for most of the companies, it sounds like the communities are expecting too much, more than what they can pay for. So one of the metrics which is missing for me also is what are the governments doing with the mining taxes? So this is missing a lot. So it sounds like the agreement which is signed between the companies and the government do not allow any accountability from the government to the company. And as you know, with some of these fragile states, there is no accountability from the government to the local communities. So we have civilians complaining because they don't see any development in their areas, but they have no space, to ask questions to the governments because of how you can imagine the government system in those countries. We have all the system of corruption and people protecting each other, and we have the companies saying they have to stay apart. Then they cannot stay in the middle between the population and the government. So these kind of metrics or kind of indicators should also be, I think, put on table from the beginning. If there is a role which can be played by the company somehow, because they are the one facing really the frustration of the communities, they are the one facing the attacks against their equipment and their stuff. So some of these pieces are really lacking. And if I had the power, I would add those to the negotiation table.
I think I may have muted myself. Thanks a lot, Laurent. I think that's so important. And I think that also that thinking about like moving the mentality from like how do companies get stuff out of the ground with the minimum harm to a more constructive, sense of like what beyond just do no harm, but like do more good. Like what does good look like and how do we measure that? And who gets to measure that is so important. Maybe Kim, I'd be curious to hear from you, so maybe for you, I'd love to hear your USAID perspective on this, and then Alex as well.
Yeah, thanks. From a USAID perspective, the short answer is, I think it's complicated. Because going back to, for instance, what we were finding in the report, it's a complicated sector, and it matters what country you're talking about, and it matters what the biggest risks are in that particular place. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. For example, from a USAID perspective, it could be, for example, that the best thing we can do in a particular country is actually try to clarify land and resource rights. That maybe that's the thing that we can do that we think is going to make the biggest difference in the green energy mineral space, potentially. In another country, that could be something completely different. There are a number of standards that have been developed. There's the OECD standards, for example, on sourcing from high risk, and I'm going to get it wrong. Alex can correct me. In high risk and conflict affected environments, I believe is what that's called. There's those standards. There's a number of, of civil society standards. There are progressive standards, which I think are quite interesting, because it allows us to work with, for example, artisanal miners that couldn't meet the highest standards right now, and actually help move them from point A to point B as a group. And I think those kinds of standards can be really helpful in certain environments. And certainly the same standards that apply to large industrial mines should not be the same standards that apply to small artisanal mine sites. So as a short answer, or maybe a long answer, is it's complicated. And I think it matters on the place, the mineral, and the type of, whether it's how formal the mine is.
That's super insightful. And I can only imagine the challenge that, of balancing that sort of local relevance with like the set of for investors, for global accountability actors, for operators, insurance companies, to who are looking for global standards, and yet trying to balance that with something that's like locally tailored, but also sort of has that local ownership flavor. Alex, how are your companies managing that?
It's such an interesting question. I feel like as I listened to our other panelists here talk, I thought this could almost warrant its own workshop and conference, honestly, because it's so complicated. From where we stand, we have standards from our umbrella organization focused at the factory level, focused at the smelter and refiner level. We've increased the scope, as I mentioned, to encompass more minerals, to look at end use like the recyclers, circularity perspectives, and even special interest topics like forced labor audits, to look for signs and indicators of human trafficking or forced labor. But what's challenging is, yes, there are so many standards out there, actually. Are they fit for purpose? So it's that balancing constantly between, do you need a new unique standard for an issue? Because as Kim said, the challenges vary, and what you're trying to measure may change, and the entity you're evaluating or assessing may be different. But how can we also reduce the need for dozens and dozens of standards and create some efficiencies and things that can be multi-purpose? So I do think it's just a balancing act, but I would stress that for us, it's not even just a question of all of the indicators, because I admit that our job is to provide tools and resources. So we have to understand our own effectiveness, but we also are not investors or regulators who are perhaps regularly measuring company performance. So I probably don't look at the full scope beyond, my own organization in depth. But I would probably just say that, I think that's why we work with partners, and that's why even more people would be needed at the table. There's EITI as well, which is the Extractives Industry Transparency Index. There's a lot of other organizations that we partner with to help fill, not to say a gap, but just like that collaboration. So I think that it's just an interesting question to say, I think we're all getting there. We've seen the standards, but in terms of, do we need more, possibly as we expand, but also it's just important to see how we can collaborate and reduce unnecessary duplication at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I imagine that's also a conversation around standards is one that the industry doesn't get to have amongst itself. That's something that civil society or government have an opinion on. And to the degree to which, there's multi-stakeholder kinds of agreements on how we, on one hand, avoid the standard fatigue, avoid the forum shopping that comes, certify whichever standard is easiest for you, but actually lead to something that's sort of a higher order. There's something that's inherently multi-stakeholder. You talked about the EITI. I'll also flag for those in the peace and conflict space, the voluntary principles on security and human rights, which is the principal sort of multi-stakeholder initiative around some of the physical conflict, armed conflict, human rights abuses that occur in many of the natural resource industries in managing that. And so for those who are interested, definitely the voluntary principles is another one of those multi-stakeholder bodies that's really focused on sort of conflict sensitivity and human rights in the most sort of physical manifestation. We have another question. Let me see if Ali, if we can unmute Veronica to ask her question. Veronica Vos. Veronica, I see you, but you may need to unmute yourself.
Hi, you can see me?
I see that you're online. I can't see your video, but please go ahead and ask the question.
Okay. Yes, my name is Veronica. I work with the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. We're based out of Notre Dame. We work with a lot of Catholic institutions, bishops' conferences, universities, and organizations. We work with CRS. I see there's at least one person from Catholic Relief Services on here. I already did a shameless plug for our book on Catholic peace building and mining that was just published. But I was wondering, therefore, in that context, if any of the panelists have thoughts on the role that faith actors and institutions can play in making sure that mining is done in such a way that it's environmentally friendly and respectful to communities, neighboring communities.
That's a really excellent question, and certainly one where USAID has also had a big focus on faith and partnership, community partnerships. I'd be curious, I guess, to any panelist about the role of religious actors, and maybe Laurent, if you can begin, and then I'd be curious to see also as you prepared the report and thought things through, Kim, how you sort of factored in who the community people that you involved were in the background. But over to you first, Laurent.
Yeah, what Veronica is asking is a very interesting question, and I think we found ourselves many times in a situation where we have to try to answer that question. So it really depends on when this question is being asked. In the mining sector, we can be at the starting process where the mining company is just arriving and trying to create sort of relationship with local communities to explain their agenda, to explain what they have agreed with the government. Most of the religious leaders, because they are trusted in local communities, because most of the time they are much more educated, and also they already have that trust for the communities. So they are the right person to serve as facilitators of such a conversation. As you can imagine, if there is an agreement about mining exploitation in a region between the government and a big external company, most of the local communities in the village, they will really necessarily not be able to understand every nuances, in that agreement. But they trust some people, they are the religious leaders. They trust some of the traditional leaders who can sit in the middle, who can try to collect the information and translate that to the communities. There is another step where there might be some clear confrontation. So sometimes we have been also invited at a step where there were already an ongoing clear conflict and open conflict between the mining company, the artisanal miners, and the local communities. Once again, if any effort for mediation, for negotiation, we should find some people who are locally trusted, who can also bring the stakeholders around the table and try to facilitate the process. Even if we bring in our expertise in how you run a mediation, we may not be necessarily the most trusted person to sit in the middle. So we have to find with both parties who are the right persons. And I've seen many cases where these faith actors, religious leaders are the people identified by both parties to sit in the middle. And lastly, I would say, because also they are communicators, they talk to communities is part of their mandate, their role, then they have a chance once again to address some of the issues, misunderstanding, rumors, which can be circulated within the communities about the mining extraction, about also the role of the mining company. So there is a role they can play there in terms of just translating and breaking some of the rumors which are affecting the relationship between the mining actors and the communities. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Laurent did a wonderful job of explaining, I think, some of the main advantages of working with faith-based organizations. And so I'll just reiterate a few of the things that Laurent already said, which is, in my view, faith-based organizations can, in certain circumstances, they have the advantage sometimes of being able to establish trust quickly, in a community, and work with people in the community that are already have a lot of sort of social capital in those communities. And I think the third thing is being able to lower the temperature a little bit in some really contested places, or where the conflicts are very near to the surface. Then I think space-based organizations may be particularly well placed to lower the temperature and get people around the same table and talking to one another, which is really important. Thanks.
I guess just to add on that, because so much has been said, and I agree with everything my other panelists have mentioned here, is just that, yes, I think when you go into these communities, it's just important to understand the dynamics, and they could be different everywhere. So just understanding them first is important. But we have definitely been aware of the unique value and role that these organizations can play from a trust building perspective, but also from addressing some of the root causes that are affecting these communities. I would just highlight, because Thomson Reuters recognized the Good Shepherd and Bon Pastor Kolwezi organization with the Stop Slavery Award, I believe last year, for the work they've been doing around mining communities. And so as we've engaged, we always look for partners in terms of civil society, who we should work with from government or industry. And I know that name has come up to us several times. So I would encourage us all to kind of look for those partners and those parties that play a role from, again, like a mediation perspective, but also from already knowing what the challenges are and maybe already operationalizing some solutions and kind of leveraging those efforts.
Yes, I think that's a really great practical example, and it's often great to look at also what works. And one thing I think is, as anyone who also works with faith leaders, I think as Laurent was highlighting too, the importance of not only working with any local actors, sort of what can they do for us, but all, what services can they provide to my enterprise, how they're involved, from start to finish. I think the example of Bon Pasteur, but I think also some of the examples that people cited are a good model of that. We're reaching towards the end of our time, and so what I'm going to do is I'd love to open this up to each of you to give me us sort of a final thought. As we play this forward, where do you hope this goes? Obviously, we're going to have 500%, in 2% scenario, we're going to have 500% growth in these minerals. What, in the value of the mineral, what do you hope that means, for each of the organizations, each of the sectors? So I'd love to maybe just go down, starting with Kim, like where do you, and then down to Laurent and Alex to tie us off. Where do you hope that this is going? And then for those who are participating here and those who will be following along online, how can people get involved? If you have anything to plug, how people can get more involved on USAID's, thinking on this, how they can get involved in RMI, how they can get involved in some of the things that you're following with Search, how can they learn more? So let me give it over to you first, Kim, with those two things. Where do you hope we go, and what do you hope this boom means, and how can people get involved?
Yeah, good question. Sort of for thinking in the long term, I hope where this goes is that we will be able to meet our climate goals, and we will do so in a way that makes the world that makes the developing world more prosperous and more just. I mean, ultimately, that's where I hope it goes. And I think what that means is raising standards, establishing responsible supply chains, making sure that we understand our supply chains. We know where they're coming from and know how to improve them, and are working with civil society organizations and others that can help monitor on the ground. It means all of those things. It means really watching and paying attention to where our minerals are coming from, and doing it in such a way that contributes to development and prosperity. That would be my overall vision. Easy, right? And in terms of if you want to learn more or get involved, honestly, probably the best way to do it would be to get in contact with me personally. I'm trying to think of any other concrete ways to get engaged right now. And I think it's probably get in touch with me.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that openness, and I trust you'll drop your contact information in the chat box so people can follow up and really appreciate you also just coming to share this with us and with our community here today. Laurent, what about you? You should share a little bit about what does a win look like from your perspective, and how can people get involved in the work that you do?
Yeah, I have a kind of dream I would like to share here. My dream is that we're moving to a step where what we used to call the mining extraction will no longer be only about extraction. It should become a kind of mining programming or something like that, meaning it's not only a mining company extracting mineral from an area, but it's a comprehensive program bringing a set of stakeholders with different expertise and involving as much as possible local communities for a long-term relationship. I'm dreaming that those mining areas that I've visited in the past will, if they get to be in the future also targeted by any kind of extraction, they will see a higher interest for local development. As I said before, I used to call it a kind of collect and fly approach, which should definitely stop. And we need to see more technology actors, stakeholders, a big part of the mining value chain coming to the areas where the mining is being extracted, instead of just collecting the minerals and leave the country. So if these people would access to the road, would see this as an opportunity for them to get new skills, to be able to cover some of the staffing needs from the mining companies or the other partners arriving in the field, if they can be much better educated, that would be helpful for the road and also helpful for these communities. This is my dream. And the way to be involved is not only about me, but as I said before, the most we can have people representing actually local communities around the table when people are dealing about mining, that the most we can also meet some of their expectations. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. We'll come to Alex for your final thought. And I realize there was one question as well that I missed in the chat box that I'd love to come back to. And I think is also super interesting. And that is, as you look at this sector from RMI, are there things that you're trying to learn from other industries? Someone pointed out sort of the responsible fishing communities. I think others might, community of stakeholders. Others, I think, chocolate, coffee are other kinds of high value commodities that often come from similarly kind of challenging cases. So first, let me ask you to respond. So I'd love to maybe you can do some artisanry and meld those two questions together about where you hope we're going and what are the kinds of other examples that you're looking for, particularly from outside of the minerals industry and supply chain. And then finally, if you tie it off, I imagine RMI maybe among the newer institutions for many of our colleagues. So and RBA, Responsible Business Alliance. So if you do want to highlight how people can learn more and get involved in some of the products that you guys and convenings you guys put together, please go ahead and share that. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. And I'll watch time. I know that's a few questions merged into one. So yes, of course, please feel free to visit us. We have our websites that are linked, the Responsible Business Alliance and the Responsible Minerals Initiative. And I'm happy to work with our lovely hosts as well to send those website links through. But you can visit us there. You can contact us. My picture is on the website. You can contact me directly as well. We are a membership organization, so there are certain requirements to be a member, but we do have many partners and stakeholders that we work with. We're very collaborative in that sense, so please feel free to reach out and send a note. In response to the question of learning from other industries, yes, can't do enough of that. I think it's helpful in the sense when I reference the career paths that so many of us have taken, many of us came from other sides of the supply chain or other sectors. So we try to bring that lens, but those connections have to be continuous. We have to keep learning from case studies, from best practice, from positive examples. And so I think for us, it's always finding linkages of how we can continue to learn and make those connections, especially for our members. So we try to stay on top of research on, fair wage discussions and how someone addressed a transparency challenge in another sector. So that's very important, and we always welcome those conversations and dialogues. And I think for the last question of where do we see this going, I'm extremely optimistic and I'm hopeful that in a few years we can come back and have some very powerful cases to look at in terms of what went right. I know constructive criticism and evaluation is important, but at this point, a few members that had joked to me recently, they're calling it the year of action. They said, we're really tired of just talking and learning and, seeing what we can understand and absorb. Let's put some of this into practice. Let's see what we can do. Let's try some things. So I don't think for us, it's about getting this right, the first time. Again, this is, we all have to learn and evolve together on what works and have constant feedback loops. But I really think there are a lot of people who want to see these challenges addressed in some way and see some efforts taken. So I really hope we're coming back in a few years to say, look at this really positive case from lithium or cobalt, and how can we apply this to other sectors? And that's really my hope right now.
Thanks so much. I think that's a great way to end, and I hope this has been incredibly enlightening for me. But I think it's also been a reminder of how far we've been advancing in silos in some sense in the conversations within civil society, not only in the responsible business section of civil society, but also people who care about particular societies, Congo, Argentina, Colombia, Guinea, Madagascar, and so forth. Could be better plugged in or be making more of an investment for ourselves and for our own communities and understanding these issues and engaging with the kinds of communities that you represent, Alex. At the same time, I think there's a lot of window for industry to be much more open and structured in the different ways that it engages civil society, and particularly in that process of harmonizing the multiple demands that often get placed on industry, but in a way that blends that sort of local legitimacy and global practicality. And then finally, government, I think, within any multi-stakeholder process, government is not only sort of, plays a number of different roles. Well, USAID as a group that, supporting development and poverty alleviation and prosperity, but also the role that government can play in facilitating the business environment, advocating for a freer civil society environment, and in seeing how we can take Laurent's call to action from the beginning, ensure that the next industrial revolution not only doesn't repeat the mistakes of past industrial revolutions, but actually sees as an opportunity to undo some harm, address some inequalities and imbalances, and lead to the kind of prosperity that all of us hope for, and in particular in the context of trying to preserve sort of the planet that's home to us all. So thank you everyone for joining. Thanks so much for this conversation. Thanks to everyone who participated. And really keen for follow-up. People who want to connect with me, I'm mjobbins at sfcg.org. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, as are probably, I think, all of our colleagues, and really keen to keep this conversation going. So thanks everyone for spending your morning, your afternoon, your evening with us. Thanks to our panelists for presenting that. Please do take a chance to download the report in great depth that Kim shared, and have a wonderful rest of the sessions at PeaceCon, and a great afternoon. Bye-bye.